Welcome back, everybody. We're still working on chapter 3. We go into it. Last time we did argument basics, and hopefully you remember a lot of that. The main thing being, right, the idea of an argument, a conclusion supported by one or more premises, right, where the premises provide reasons for believing that the conclusion is true. And this is central for critical thinking because as a critical thinker, what is your thing? What are we doing? Right? We're evaluating beliefs and reasons for them. Right? Whether or not we should accept a belief, whether we should add it to the map that guides our everyday behavior. See, all these things connect. So I hope you can connect all these things, all the things we talked about during the first week, right? That internal map in your mind. Well, now that you are the caretaker of that map, right? You want to make sure that the beliefs that you have in here are accurate and have good reasons for them. And also, if you're going to add another belief to your mind, you also want to make sure that there's good reasons for them. So when you evaluate a belief and the reasons for it, then you are evaluating an argument. Right? And then once we identify it as an argument, then we can give it some technical vocabulary, right? We can say that the supporting reasons are called premises, and the main thing, the main claim that you're wondering about, right? Should I add this to my mind? Should I take it out of my mind? Right? What should you do? Right? That's the conclusion. So every argument is a conclusion, a single sentence that expresses a belief or a statement about the world, about the way reality is. Right? And then that conclusion is supported by reasons. And then we can evaluate that argument, right? Then we can ask things like the truth question and the logic question. The truth question is, are those supporting reasons actually true? Are the premises true? And the logic question is, well, if they are true, does that mean that the conclusion is true? Either because it logically follows or just because it's highly likely to be true if the premises are true. And that's the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. Hopefully you know all that. Hopefully you can say it just like how I did, right? You should expect yourself to for the quiz, right? The quiz, I'm going to put it up today still, and it'll go over those things. So I hope you know those things. Okay? Now, let us go into judging arguments. I don't know why this is all off. That does not look right. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, that's better. No, it went right back. I don't know why it's doing that. I guess it doesn't matter a whole lot. It just doesn't look good. I'm getting OCD about it. Is that better or worse? I don't know. I guess I'll just leave it like that. So you're, as a critical thinker, you are in the business of evaluating arguments, right? So that means in most cases, you'll be presented with arguments out there in the world, right? Politics is always such a good example where everyone's got some sort of opinion about something, right? And then if they are informed enough, they can actually give you reasons for whatever they're arguing for, right? And so be on the lookout for that. But the thing is, people present a lot of information when they try to communicate or they try to convince you of things. There's a lot of stuff that they say. So your job is always to hone in on, well, what is the main point here? What is the main claim that this person is making? What is their whole stance? What is their thing, right? What are they trying to convince you of? So that's going to be the conclusion, right? So you're going to find the conclusion first and then find the premises that support it. Okay, having again some issues here. because my phone is disconnected again. Okay, let's try it once more. So we learned some techniques for that, right? One of the main things that we can use are premise and conclusion indicators, right? So words like so, uh, therefore, thus, that means you're getting the conclusion. That means you're getting the main thing, right? The main stamp that's being taken. Other words like because and since indicate that you're going to be given a premise, right? A supporting reason. So if we go back to this example, right? No one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada, so no one should buy it. Right? Well, the word so tells us that we're being given a conclusion, right? So is a conclusion indicator. Now, I also think you can just look at the arguments and use your logical mind, right? Even though our logical minds don't always work, sometimes they can unassisted, right? Later on, we're going to learn logic so we can actually prove if something is right or not, if something is deductively valid. But right here, I think you could just look at each of the statements and kind of determine what the main point is and what the supporting reasons are, because no other way really works, right? This way it really works. There's a nice logical flow through it, right? No one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada, so therefore no one should buy Old Guzzler beer, right? That conclusion follows logically from the premises. So even though hopefully some of you are looking at the argument and going, well, that's not a very good argument, that's opinion based, right? Someone just saying no one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Well, yeah, that's an answer to the truth question, right? When we're evaluating the arguments. Right? We ask, are the premises true? And then we also ask separately, if the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion must also be true, or is at least likely to be true on the basis of the premises? Right? And in this case, we can say yes, if it's really true, right? Because for the logic question, you don't have to actually know whether the premises are true. You just imagine to yourself, let's say, right? You could say, for the sake of argument, let's say that no one should buy beer brewed in Canada. And let's say that Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada. Well, then it logically follows that no one should buy Old Guzzler beer, right? So it passes the logic test, but it probably fails the truth quest, right? Is that really true that no one should buy beer brewed in Canada? I don't know that that's true at all. Yes, Red, go ahead. You can just unmute yourself and you can talk out loud if you want. But you do have to unmute yourself. There's that little a little thing that looks like a microphone down at the bottom. Let me see. Can I? You also seem to be locked. Oh, no, unlocked. I don't know why you're locked. Okay, and yeah, that's all I can do. So you have to unmute yourself if you want to say anything, or you can type it. Well, anyway, so I was just going on a little digression here just to remind you of this idea of how we evaluate the argument, right? That we look at the truth of the premises, and then that's the truth question. And then the logic question is, how well do those premises support the conclusion, right? In other words, if those premises were to be true, would that mean that the conclusion logically follows or is highly likely to be true in an inductive argument? This is a deductive argument, right? If both of these premises are true, that conclusion's got to be true. Since we're doing brunch, I bet Judy will be late. After all, she's always late for brunch, right? Or she's usually late for brunch, rather, is what it says. There we can see that there's the word since. right? Since is a premise indicator. So we know that we're doing brunch is a premise. And then right after the premise, we get, I bet Judy will be late, right? So we know that that's the main conclusion. And that means that the other statement right after is another premise, right? So the way that this one is presented, it kind of goes premise, conclusion, and then premise. And sometimes it's like that. The way that people present arguments, right, they do it in all sorts of ways, right? Sometimes people say the conclusion first, sometimes they say it last, sometimes it's in the middle. When we're doing logic and critical thinking, we like to make little diagrams, right? We like to go premise, premise, conclusion. But out in the wild, where people present arguments and people think about arguments, they don't always do it like that. So in this case, we get a premise first, we're doing lunch, and then we get the conclusion, I bet Judy will be late. And then she's usually late for brunch. Right? That's another premise. And notice how we clean things up when we put them in this format, this premise, conclusion format. Now, I don't think that you'll be doing it like this in real life, but I like that beautiful mind analogy that I used last time. I actually used that perfect mind at one point. I meant to say beautiful mind, right? If everyone knows that reference, that movie, right, where somebody can just sort of mathematically see all these relationships almost like visually around them. Now, this will be difficult if you have aphantasia, right? If you don't have an inner theater where you can see things. But it's that sort of thing where you find an argument out in the wild, like, since we're doing brunch, I bet Judy will be late. After all, she's usually late for brunch. And then you unpack it and rearrange it and go, we're doing brunch. Judy is usually late for brunch. It's almost robotic, right? Therefore, Judy will be late. Notice also I took out she and just made it Judy. We want to be explicit when we do this, right? So we just leave out these filler words like after all. That's not really part of the conclusion, right? Get rid of that. That's not really doing any logical work, right? And we get rid of the conclusion indicator. So all we're left with are these simple statements that when we look at each of them, we can see that the two premises lead to that conclusion, right? Now, this is different from the previous one, right? Because in this case, we're not guaranteed the truth of the conclusion. Judy might not be late this time, right? Just because she's usually late for brunch doesn't mean that she definitely will be late. It just means it's really, really likely, right? So that makes this an inductive argument. But laying it out like this allows you to really see the logic of it, so you can ask the logic question, and you're isolating the bare statements that you need to evaluate for truth. So whenever you reconstruct an argument like this, whether really on paper, like we'll do in the classes as an exercise, or sort of like in your mind, you always want to be as specific as you can, right? What are we talking about? You don't want to really say she, he, it's, right? Vague terms if we know exactly what we're referring to. In step 2, you ask the question. Now, this is, I should have prefaced this all. This is how the textbook suggests you evaluate an argument when you find it, right? You do these steps. I don't necessarily think you have to do it specifically in this way, right? It's a nice method if you need a method, but you can also just sort of come to understand and come to recognize arguments pretty quickly as either being deductive or inductive, and then you can judge, is it valid or invalid for deductive arguments? Is it strong or weak for inductive arguments? Right. So the very quick way of all this is this an inductive argument or deductive argument? If it's a deductive argument, ask yourself, is it valid or invalid? If it's an inductive argument, you ask yourself, is it weak or strong? Right. That's all stuff from the last meeting. I hope that's all fresh in your mind. I never know how much I should review and how much I should assume if you remember. Anyway, let's do what the textbook says, right? Let's go through the steps as they suggest. And then later you can change your method if you want. But for now, this is not a bad way to do it, right? Look at the argument and ask yourself, if the premises are true, is this one of those arguments where the conclusion must be true, where the conclusion logically follows? If yes, then you're gonna say it's a deductive argument, right? Because remember, right, in deductive arguments, the argument is supposed to present conclusive support for the conclusion. That means if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In inductive arguments, it's weaker than that. With inductive argument, the truth of the premises just means that the conclusion is really likely to be true. It's probably true, right? It's probably true enough to just treat it as true. That's most of our everyday is like that, right? Is it possible? Is it just logically possible that you are dreaming right now, right? Or that you are in a very advanced simulation? Can you completely rule that out? Well, maybe not, right? So, but you can say that's probably not happening. I'm probably just really in my room, right? So probably doesn't mean very, very doubtful. It doesn't mean that at all. It means there's hardly any doubt, right? It's just not quite as strong as in a deductive argument, where if the premises are true, then the conclusion is unavoidably true. It must logically be true, because basically in a deductive argument, the premises are basically already saying the conclusion, right? It's logically entailed by the premises, so the conclusion must be true. So if it's like that, if you see that it's one of these arguments where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, then you've said it passes the logic question, right? The premises do support the conclusion in a deductively valid way. Because remember what valid means. In a valid argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's in a successful deductive argument. Remember, you can have an unsuccessful deductive argument, right? You have somebody trying to present an argument where the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, but they fail, right? It doesn't work. That's still a deductive argument. It's just an invalid one. So if the answer to the soundness question, remember, sound means it's valid and the premises are true. That the argument passes the logic question and the truth question. Right? For a deductive argument, when it passes both, we call it sound. Again, we talked about this last time, so hopefully that's in your notes, however you retain this information. Right? If no, then go to the next step. If yes, then you're done, right? Right. If the argument in front of you is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, and the premises are true, right? It passes both of those tests, then the argument is sound, and you should accept its conclusion, right? Then you're done. But if that's not the case, right, then you go to the next step. But first, let's just look at an argument, right? This is in the original, the way you might find it out in the wild, and then the reconstructed version. So in this case, no one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada. Therefore, no one should buy Old Guzzler beer. Well, it is valid, right? If those premises are true, then that conclusion must be true. So it passes the logic test. It's valid. It's logically valid. Does that mean it's a good argument overall? No, because for it to be a good argument overall, it has to be sound. It cannot just pass one question. Right? So this is one of those confusing things where in everyday life, when someone says that's valid, they mean it's like all good. It's totally good, right? In critical thinking, no, valid is just good for the logic part of it. It's good that it's valid, but that's not enough. The premises need to be true, right? And in this case, it's very difficult to make the case that these premises are true, right? Maybe I can imagine some scenario where morally you have to boycott Canada or something like that, right? Sometimes there's a political or moral reason for not buying a product from a certain place. So maybe you could come up with some sort of argument to support premise one, right? A sub-argument, right? An argument for a premise is called a sub-argument. But in this case, we don't have that, and it just sounds kind of ludicrous, right? I don't need to accept that premise. It's not some scientifically known thing. It's not a historically known thing. It's not a fact. It's not a general fact. There's no argument for it being some sort of political or moral directive or anything like that. So I, as a critical thinker, would reject this argument because I have no reason to accept premise number one, right? We'd also have to check, is Old Guzzler beer actually brewed in Canada, right? What if that turns out to be false? What if Old Guzzler beer is brewed in the good old United States, right, or somewhere else? Then it would also fail, right? It would fail the truth question. And so if you fail either the truth question or the logic question, the argument is not sound, right? And that means it's a bad argument. You cannot accept the conclusion on the basis of that argument. Now, I should probably have a whole other time when I record something just to make this point. Maybe I can make it right now really quickly. When you do figure out that an argument is bad, right, like in this case, that doesn't automatically mean that the conclusion is false. Okay, it just means that this particular argument does not show it to be true. Maybe there's another argument that does show that it's true, right? So you have to keep that in mind. When you debunk someone's argument, it doesn't automatically mean that their conclusion is false. It just means you can't accept it as true on the basis of that particular argument. Right? So maybe there's another good reason that no one should buy Old Guzzler beer. I don't know. Maybe there's some other good argument for that conclusion. This argument, though, should not convince you, right? That's all you can really say when you find out that an argument is unsound, right, or not cogent in the case of inductive arguments. Right? In other words, if the argument fails in any way at all, right, on logic or on truth, all you can say is this argument does not support the conclusion. Right? Maybe there's some other reason to believe the conclusion, right? But you can't say the argument's bad, therefore the conclusion is false. It does not work like that. So in this case, the conclusion does logically follow. Whereas here, be very careful here. Let's slow down. Let's look at this argument. Everyone should buy beer brewed in Canada. Truth question, right? The truth test. It's another one of these ridiculous kind of statements. Who says, right? I could reject that premise, but Ranch IPA beer is not brewed in Canada. Again, we'd have to check to see if that's factual or not. Therefore, no one should buy Ranch IPA. Right? Okay, well, I'm skeptical about the truth question, but we can still ask the logic question. Remember, once again, you can always ask the logic question, even if you don't know if the premises are true or not. All you have to do is imagine, what if the world were like that? What if both of those premises were true? Okay, let me imagine that it is really true that everyone should buy beer brewed in Canada. Right? Everyone should do that. Okay, let's just say it's true, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, right? We can do that, right? You can use your imagination, because all we're trying to figure out is, would the truth guarantee the truth of the conclusion? So let's just imagine. Let's say these were true. Everyone should buy beer brewed in Canada. Ranch IPA beer is not brewed in Canada, so no one should buy Ranch IPA. Now, you might be fooled by this one. This is why you need to take logic, right? Because you might think that this is right because it kind of looks like the other one. But this one's wrong, right? Because notice what the first premise says. It just says people should buy beer brewed in Canada. It does not say that you should only buy beer brewed in Canada. Right? It doesn't say that. The first premise leaves it completely open that you can also buy beer from somewhere else. Right? You could imagine a slightly different argument where I say, well, for this party, let's make sure we have some beer from Canada. And then someone says, well, this one is not brewed in Canada. Am I going to say, well, that one's not allowed then? No, that one's still allowed too, but I also want some Canadian beer, right? So if you sit down and slow down and think about this carefully, you will see that even if both of the premises are true, that conclusion does not have to be true, right? even if everyone should buy beer brewed in Canada, and even if this particular beer is not brewed in Canada, well, that first argument doesn't say you can't buy non-Canadian beer, right? Doesn't say that. It just says, hey, let's also buy beer from Canada, right? So in this case, even though it seems to have that logical flow, it actually doesn't. I hope you can just see that, but, you know, again, we'll do logic later where you can actually prove it. My beverage is soda water, by the way. It's still a little bit too early for beer. Maybe I should do this at like 8 or 9 next time so I can enjoy a Guinness or something, or a Ranch IPA. What about this one? Now, these steps are all from the textbook, right? But I'm trying to give examples so that we can think about the steps with an actual example. Since we're doing brunch, I bet Judy will be late. After all, she's usually late for lunch. Right? Okay, we put it in the nice formats, right? We get rid of the extra words. We're doing brunch. Judy is usually late for brunch. Therefore, Judy will be late. Right? And you can kind of tell probably, right, that you kind of are adding in your mind probably that she will be late, right? Because the premises only show that that's probably the case, right? It doesn't logically follow, right? But this is where things get tricky for some people. This previous argument, the conclusion doesn't logically follow, and the whole thing falls apart because it's just not a sound deductive argument. It's trying to be a deductive argument. It's trying to say if these premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. In this case, because the conclusion doesn't logically follow, we say it's an invalid and therefore unsound deductive argument. Reject the argument completely. In this case, the conclusion also doesn't logically follow because it could be false, but if the premises are true, at least the conclusion is highly likely to be true, which we don't have anything like that for this one, right? Because this is a deductive argument. It's not trying to show that the conclusion is likely to be true if the premises are true. It's trying to tell you that the conclusion logically follows, which it doesn't. In this case, it doesn't logically follow that it must be true, right? But it does follow in the sense that it's highly probable if those premises are true. So I know that can be confusing, right? Because we have two different arguments where the conclusion doesn't logically follow. The deductive one is bad, is wrong. It's a bad argument. This is not such a bad argument, right? Because in this case, the truth of the premise is not supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It doesn't matter that it doesn't logically follow. What matters is that it follows inductively, that it's highly likely to be true if the premises are true. Right? The premises make the conclusion likely to be true. So it's an inductive argument. And if both of those premises are true, it's a pretty strong one, right? If Judy's like almost always late, let's say you do this brunch every Sunday and Judy is always late, right? Because of her car, probably, remember from last time, right? Well, it's a pretty good guess, right? If you're getting together with your friends for brunch and, you know, Judy should have been here, and you're like, well, she's probably going to be late. Usually is. Yeah, that's a strong argument. And if those premises are true, right, if you really are doing brunch and she really is usually late for brunch, then that conclusion is highly likely to be true. And that means it's a strong inductive argument. Because in inductive argument, the fact that it doesn't logically follow doesn't matter. Right? It only matters that it follows inductively in a strong way. All right, so for step 2, you're basically trying to figure out, is this a deductive argument where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion? For step 3, you're asking, well, if the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion is probably true, likely to be true, most likely true? And if it is that kind of an argument, then you can identify it as inductive, right? Which is what you would have done for that previous argument. So if it's true, if the truth of the premises means that the conclusion is likely to be true, then it's an inductive argument and it's a strong argument. Right? And then you should just check to see if the premises are actually true. Then we'll say that it's cogent. Right? So just as a reminder once more, with deductive arguments, if it passes the logic test, we call it valid. If it passes the logic test and the truth test, the premises are actually true, then we call it sound. That's what a deductive argument needs to be. It needs to be sound. It needs to pass both the logic question and the truth question. For inductive arguments, if it passes the logic question, then it is strong. Right? And for that, the logic question, we just mean, would the conclusion be likely to be true if the premises are true? And if it passes both the logic and the truth question, then we can call it cogent, right? So right here, when it says, if you find out that it's valid, then we should check to see if it's cogent, right? Well, if it's valid, then all we need to figure out is, are the premises true? And if they are, then it's cogent. If they're not, then it's not cogent and the argument fails. So notice that deductive and inductive arguments can both fail if the premises are not true. So this is where this argument would really apply, right? If you look at this argument, ask yourself, since we looked at it earlier and said, if the premises are true, must the conclusion be true? We said, no, it might not be true, right? Judy might not be late today, even though she usually is. It's not guaranteed that she's going to be late just because she usually is. So for step 2, no, it doesn't, it's not a deductive argument, right? But here, if we ask if the premises are true, is the conclusion probably true? Yeah, it is, right? So then it's an inductive argument, right? And that means it's strong. And then all we really have to know is, are these premises true? This is just a toy example, so we can just imagine a situation where they are true. We can imagine a situation where they're not true, right? So this would just depend on the context where someone's giving that argument, right? So you just figure out, right? Someone might say, "Wait a minute, no, it's not Judy, right? It's Jim that's always late." Right? Someone might correct you on that, right? And that would also end up being not a cogent argument, right? It would pass the logic question because the truth of the premises makes that conclusion really likely, but it might fail the truth question if you're wrong about the person, if it's Jim instead of Judy, and maybe you're doing dinner and not brunch. Maybe you're confused. So even though the conclusion doesn't logically follow, the premises make the conclusion likely to be true. Right? So that's what makes it different from an invalid deductive argument. But now let's look at this, right? Slight variation. We're doing brunch. Judy was late for brunch once. I bet Judy's going to be late. In this case, we can tell it's trying to be an inductive argument, but it's very weakly supported, right? Judy was late once. You're giving her a hard time, right? Just because she was late once, it's not likely that she's going to be late every single time, right? So this is still an inductive argument, but in this case, if the premises are true, it doesn't mean the conclusion is likely to be true, right? It provides some support, but it's very, very weak support. It's just not enough for us to say, yeah, she's probably going to be late. It's just not enough. It's a weak inductive argument. So you kind of have to distinguish, right? Is this trying to be an inductive argument or trying to be a deductive argument? And you can then fail, right, at either of those attempts. Right. So if you get to this part, it basically means that the argument has failed the logic question, right? If the argument intended to offer conclusive or probable support for its conclusion, but fails to do so, is it supposed to give a deductively valid argument or an inductively strong argument, but fails to do so, right? Then you've eliminated two possibilities, right? You've eliminated the idea that it's a valid argument or a strong argument, right? So you know it's going to fail. Right. So that would just end up meaning that what you have on your hands is an invalid argument or a weak argument, right? So it's either a deductive argument where the truth of the premises fails to provide conclusive support for the conclusion, or it's an inductive argument where the premises, if they're true, fail to provide probable support for the conclusion. And then you just kind of want to know, well, what type was it, right? What was it going for? And you kind of just look at it, right? This is why I say you can take these steps and do them in different orders, right? I would recommend just looking at the argument, reading it over a couple times, and just think to yourself, is this supposed to be an inductive argument or a deductive argument? And then proceed to judge it accordingly. So the way that this does it, the way that this sets it out, I don't think it's the most efficient way to do it, but it's the way that the textbook says it. So you can go ahead and follow it. But I think you could also do it in a slightly different order. You could also just look at the argument and think about it, and it'll make sense to you. You'll start to see that this is trying to be a deductive argument, and this is trying to be an inductive argument. Then once you figured it out, then you ask the truth question and the logic question, right? You ask yourself, are the premises true? And then you ask, if they were true, regardless if they are true, let's just imagine that they are, would that mean that the conclusion has to be true, right? If we're talking about a deductive argument. Or if it's an inductive argument, would that mean that the conclusion is likely to be true, probably true? So I think that's a slightly simplified way of doing it. But you could follow this as well, right? And if you're not totally sure, you can also look for indicator words, like if someone says, therefore it logically follows, right? Then that's probably going to be a deductive argument. Or if it's somebody says, therefore probably, dot, 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 then it's probably going to be an inductive argument, right? So you can look at context clues. You can look at the overall format of it. You can use those things to determine. So it's a little bit like I would say to almost do this in the reverse. I would say first figure out, is it deductive or inductive? Then ask the truth question. Then ask the logic question, which in a deductive argument, it's one way, and an inductive argument, it's a different way, right? For a deductive argument, you ask, if the premises are true, must the conclusion be true? I know I'm repeating myself a lot. For the inductive, if the premises are true, is the conclusion likely to be true? Okay, so this is a class exercise that you will do. This is exercise 3.2. I'll create a slot for this. Oh, there's a pop-up. Oh, yeah. The share the QR code. You're right. Let's see. There we go. My first. It was blocking my first typo of the day. I almost always have some sort of typo, and this was nicely blocking, hiding my mistake. Some should not be capitalized there. Okay, so go through each of these and figure out, right, whether it's a deductive argument or an inductive argument. First step. Then, if it's a deductive argument, tell me, is this a valid argument or an invalid argument? Or if you determine that it's an inductive argument, you tell me if it's a strong argument or a weak argument. So if the argument was all cats are cute, Dorian is a cat, so Dorian is cute, then you can determine, right? Is this a deductive argument or an inductive argument? You could use some of those steps if you want, right? But hopefully you could just see that this is one of those deductive arguments, right? It looks like it's trying to be a logical argument where it just follows logically, right? So in this case, it actually does. This is a deductive argument. We're supposed to think that the conclusion follows logically from the premises, and it does, so it's valid. So all you'd have to write is deductive, valid. Just to contrast that one with number 2, for example, I'll give you the answer. Ethel graduated from Yale. If she graduated from Yale, she probably has a superior intellect. I bet she has a superior intellect. Well, here the conclusion follows, not logically necessarily, but inductively, right? It's a probable kind of an argument. Right? It's meant to provide probabilistic support. That one's a kind of a bad example because the way that it's phrased, it almost could be a deductive argument. Kind of a bad example. That one's from the textbook. They're not all from the textbook, but some of them are. So that one, I think it's supposed to try to be an inductive. It's providing probable support, right? We have indicator words like I bet, right, or probably. So those make it seem like an inductive argument, right? And so then you just have to ask, if both of those premises are true, does that provide support for the idea that Ethel has a superior intellect, right? Okay. And it provides probabilistic support. Yeah, I think I'm pretty confident to call it an inductive argument. But let me look at number 5 as a better contrast. Right? Almost all philosophers are absent-minded. Since my teacher is a philosopher, I'm guessing he's absent-minded. Right? For that one, you would definitely say inductive, strong. Right? Now, is it true that almost all philosophers are absent-minded? I doubt it, right? So the truth question is different here. But for the logic question, all we're asking is, if both of those statements were true, would that provide strong support for the conclusion? Well, if it was true that almost every single philosopher is absent-minded, and it's true that your teacher is a philosopher, then it's highly, highly, highly likely that they are one of the absent-minded ones. Is it conclusive? No, they might not be. They might be one of the few, right, that isn't absent-minded. Right? So that means it's an inductive argument, but it's strong, right? If both of those premises were true, then that conclusion would be pretty likely to be true. So for all cats are cute, Dorian is a cat, so Dorian is cute, you're right. Deductive, valid, right? For 5, you write inductive, strong. Right? You might find another deductive argument that's invalid, or then you would write deductive, invalid. You might also find an inductive argument that's weak instead of strong, right? This was a strong one, but you might find a weak one. Then you would write inductive, weak, okay? So for each of these, you're going to give 2 words, right? You're going to tell me whether it's inductive or deductive, and then you're going to tell me for deductive ones, is it valid or invalid? For inductive ones, is it strong or weak? Okay, one more quick part. This won't take that long. Today will be a relatively short session, I think. Not too painful, hopefully. I know I do repeat a lot. And it's much more fun to do this in person. There's different ways to teach this stuff. You know, this is the only way that I know how to somewhat be interactive and play an active role is just to present this stuff. But doing it in class is a little bit more engaging, I think. So here's the thing, right? Hopefully you've kind of seen this difference between arguments out in the wild, right? The way that you actually find them, and versus the way that we think about it kind of more abstractly when we're being critical thinkers, right? The way that I take, some words, a sentence, and break it down into premises and a conclusion, right? And I leave out some of the words and things like that. Uh, Out in the wild, people don't do that, right? They don't necessarily make everything so explicit. They just kind of give you information, right? So very often when we communicate, we do that. We give people the information that we think is relevant, and then we sort of make them just fill in the blanks because we can't communicate everything all the time. We have to make certain assumptions that you can read between the lines, right? That you can sort of fill in the blanks yourself, right? So if I say, move, there's a car, I don't have to tell you, well, you should move when there's a car coming because the car might hit you, and I don't think you would like it if the car hit you, therefore you better move, right? I don't need to fill all that out, right? I just assume that you don't want to get hit by a car. I don't have to give you that piece of information. I assume you know that. What you need to know is that there's a car coming. Right? You can fill in the rest yourself. Right? You need to know that you got to move because there's a car coming. Right? You can figure out that missing link yourself, right? The idea that you should move away from a car. So that makes total sense. And we also do this when we present arguments, and that kind of makes sense as well. It's just the way that we communicate. Right? It's just as critical thinkers, we can't leave any information unspoken. We need to be able to look at it all in order to determine. Right? We need to ask the truth question. We need to know, are the premises true? And in order to ask that question, we have to make sure that all the premises are being presented, that they are seeing the light of day, that there are no unspoken assumptions. Because that can often happen. Someone can present a whole argument that's resting on an unspoken assumption, and that unspoken assumption might actually be problematic. It might not be something obvious like getting out of the way of a car. It might be something much more controversial, right? But sometimes we miss that, right? And we might think an argument is good, but it's actually resting on a false assumption, on some sort of tacit missing premise. Right? So I've presented some version of this argument in the past, right? And in this philosophical argument, it actually becomes crucial. But someone might just say, all events are determined by the past, so we have no free will. So all events are determined by the past, we have no free will. Well, hopefully you see that there's some information missing there. Like the premise talks about events, about being determined, about the past. Right? We have three concepts there: events, determine, past. The conclusion is talking about what we have and not having it, and something called free will. Completely different concepts. It's not clear, right? The argument doesn't make it clear what the connection is. You might expect the person to fill in the blanks, but technically, this is just saying A, therefore B, without there being any kind of logical structure to it that tells us that A somehow leads to B. So there's a missing premise here. Maybe it's more obvious than this one. Janice went to Yale, so she's probably highly intelligent. We put it in premise conclusion format. It says Janice went to Yale. Then conclusion, Janice is highly intelligent. It's easy to see what's missing, right? But as a critical thinker, you have to actually make that missing information explicit. And we'll get into the missing stuff in just a second. I just want to show you the arguments with missing premises. Right? Here we have some stuff missing. As critical thinkers, you have to know all the relevant information. So sometimes that missing information might turn out not to be very important, and it makes sense that we left it unspoken, but we got to make sure, right? Critical thinkers, what do? Evaluate arguments. How do we do that? We ask the truth question and we ask the logic question. We can only ask the truth question if we actually see all the premises in front of us. So we have to sort of tease those out, right? We have to tease out the missing premises. We have to make that implicit assumption explicit. Right? Everything has to see the light of the day. The light of the day, right? Everything has to see. Everything has to come under the light of reason. Like, to be very dramatic about it. We don't want anything hidden in the dark, right? Expose it all. So to properly do this, you have to first kind of have a sense of, is this an inductive argument or a deductive argument? Because the way that you supply the missing premise and how you frame it, how you phrase it, will depend on that. You have to know the general spirit of the argument, right? Where is it coming from? So you really have to read the argument a few times, understand it, contextualize it, right? Who is presenting the arguments? What is the main, right? Again, what is the conclusion? You should figure that out, right? What is the main claim being made? What do you think they're going for? This is sometimes kind of guesswork, but it's intelligent guesswork, right? You're making an educated guess. And when you fill in that missing premise, right, as a critical thinker, again, you have to evaluate the argument. Sometimes there's crucial information missing that tells us why the conclusion is true on the basis of the premises, right? When you do that, make sure you understand where the person's coming from. Don't put words in their mouth that they would reject, right? Don't go against the arguer's intent. So if someone's presenting an argument and you think that there's logically something kind of missing, you want to fill in those blanks, make sure you do it in a way that's consistent with that point of view that you're addressing. Now, unless you figured it out that this arguer is just tacitly assuming something that contradicts their overall view, right? That is possible. That does happen. Right? So all we're saying is be very careful about this. Don't just blurt out, hey, there's your missing premise, and that what you blurt out is not at all something that they would agree with. Right? Generally, you don't want to do that. But sometimes that's exactly the interesting thing to do, is to point out, hey, your argument completely hinges on this other claim. But you seem to not believe that claim in other contexts. What's going on here, right? So that can be a good critical thinking moment when you discover that there's a tacit claim that contradicts their general point of view. But that is a very specific situation, right? So we're saying here to be careful. And when you phrase that missing premise, don't say anything more than what you need to do, right? Be very conservative about what that claim is saying. And you don't want it to say something ridiculous if you can say something quite plausible, right? And you don't want it to contain extra information that's not necessary, right? Be very conservative about it and make it sound like the most plausible thing that it could be. We'll look at some examples. Like for this one, right? All events are determined by the past, so we have no free will. We can conclude, I think, that this arguer has a concept of free will that's just not compatible with events being determined. Right? For this person, free will means that your choices are not determined. Right? So I think we can confidently fill in that this person is trying to say, yeah, all events are determined by the past. And if all events are determined by the past, then we have no free will. Right? It's as though that's just their definition of free will. Right? Therefore, we have no free will. Now it's a nice logical argument. Now it's a nice deductive argument where we could use logic to prove that this argument is valid. Right? If premise 1 and 2 are both true, then that conclusion must be true. And the way that we supply that missing premise, it is plausible because a lot of people think that free will entails that your choices are not determined, right? So then you would agree with that statement. If all events are determined, then there is no free will. Because for you, free will means not all events are determined, right? Our choices aren't. So that's a plausible framing, right? Especially for someone who's arguing that we have no free will. This one's easier, right? Now, the previous one is a deductive. This is an inductive argument, right? You could say Janice went to Yale. If you go to Yale, then you're highly intelligent. You could put that, but notice that the original argument says Janice went to Yale, so she's probably highly intelligent. So because the word probably is there, that means you have to interpret this arguer as presenting an inductive argument, right? So that changes what you put in there. If you thought that it was a deductive argument, then you would say anyone that goes to Yale is highly intelligent. But this person said probably. So it's an inductive argument, and so that means the format should be inductive. So the missing premise in this case is something like people who went to Yale are usually highly intelligent. Because this is trying to make a probabilistic argument. It's saying very often it is the case that to go to Yale, you go to intelligence, right? Janice went to Yale, so we can make this inference, this probabilistic inference that, yeah, probably she's pretty intelligent, right? Given that most people that go to Yale. Could Janice maybe not be super intelligent? Well, the premise two suggests that maybe some people can get into Yale without being very intelligent, right? But because that word probably is there, it means we're dealing with an inductive argument. So then the way that we supply the missing premise has to reflect that. If it had said something like, so she's therefore it follows that she definitely is highly intelligent, then we would have to put a stronger premise in there. We'd have to say people who went to Yale are always highly intelligent, right? But in this case, that's saying too much. That's a good example of, we got to be conservative. It's a much more dramatic statement to say that everyone who goes to Yale is intelligent. That would take more to prove. That's harder to be true, right? As opposed to the weaker statement that they're usually highly intelligent. Right? That's more likely to pass the truth test, right? So that's kind of how you want to reconstruct these missing arguments, these missing premises. And you want them to be more plausible, right? And you want them to fit the intent. So in this case, the intent is a probabilistic argument, and it is more plausible to say people who went to Yale are usually or often very highly intelligent. Right? Again, people who went to Yale are always highly intelligent. That would be appropriate if we thought this person was presenting a deductive argument. But, it wouldn't be very smart to do a deductive argument because, again, that premise would be much more doubtful that every single person who gets into Yale is always highly intelligent. That's more doubtful, right? So you want to, as the person who's presenting or who's supplying the missing premises, or as the person who's creating the argument, you want to rely on premises that are more plausible than not plausible. It's easiest when it's a straightforward deductive argument, right? Where you can just sort of use your logical mind. And this is almost like doing little logic puzzles. And it's almost like making an inference, but in reverse, right? If I say Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, then you can make an inference to a conclusion, right? You can say, well, therefore Socrates is mortal. But in this case, you have a premise and already a conclusion, and then you have to try to infer what missing premise goes along with this. So it's almost like making an inference, but just it's an inference to a premise. So we'll just have a few examples here, and then we'll be done. Okay. If Fido is a mammal, then Fido is warm-blooded. So Fido is warm-blooded. Devon or Theodosia, we have one interaction. Can somebody type what the missing premise is here? If Fido is a mammal, then Fido is warm-blooded. So Fido is warm-blooded. What missing information do we have there? Well, I think you are making a correct inference, Theodosia, because if Fido is a mammal, then Fido is warm-blooded. That allows you to conclude that mammals are warm-blooded. So you are making a logical inference, but that's not the missing premise. So it's funny. You're being logical. You're correct in a sense. That if-then statement entails what you're saying there. So you made a nice logical inference, but that's not the premise that's missing. Because the premise just says if Fido is a mammal, then Fido is warm-blooded. The conclusion then says Fido is warm-blooded. Well, there's something missing there. Yes, that's it. Right. Fido is a mammal. Right? If Fido is a mammal, then Fido is warm-blooded. Fido is a mammal. Therefore, Fido must be warm-blooded. Right? Yes. So, Theodosia, you made a logical inference, but in this case, I was asking for the missing premise that makes this argument flow, right? That really gives it a logical structure. It's a yeah, that's no problem. Again, I could tell that you were thinking logically because you made an inference, right? That if something is a mammal, then it is warm-blooded. That means mammals are warm-blooded, right? It's a logical inference. But, yeah. I won't eat now since I only eat when I'm hungry. What's the missing premise there? Does anybody want to try again? Or are you tired of this game? Sometimes it's also hard to do things on the spot, right? Uh, Especially if you never been exposed to this kind of thing, right? I won't eat now since I only eat when I'm hungry. You could almost think about what does this logically entail, right? But it's just we're doing it in the reverse. The conclusion here is I won't eat now, right? And one of the premises, because it says since, yeah, exactly, right? That they're not hungry. Exactly, you got it. Yeah. So the argument would go, I only eat when I'm hungry. I'm not hungry right now. Therefore, conclusion, I won't eat now. Right? Exactly. I like to use examples from philosophy and theology and things like that. Again, as a reminder, the examples that I choose do not reflect my viewpoints one way or another, right? But these are arguments that people present, that people could present. Right? So someone might say, without God, there can't be any meaning to life, therefore God exists. Yes, it assumes that there is a meaning to life. Exactly, right? And this is a good example uh, where it matters, right? That you have to make these implicit premises explicit. Because you might hear this argument and not fully process it and think, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Without God, there can't be any meaning to life, so God exists. Well, there's an assumption being made here that we're not stating, right? Which is there is a meaning to life. And once you supply that, then you have a valid argument, right? Uh, then the question just becomes, are the premises true, right? So we can, when we present the missing premise, we're trying to make sure that the argument passes the logic question, right? We're helping it out. We're trying to be as nice as we can to the argument. We're assuming that this person is presenting a logical argument. So let us provide the missing piece that makes it into a logical argument, into a valid argument. But then the big question will become, well, is that premise actually true? Is that missing premise actually true? Right? That then becomes the question, right? The truth question. Oh, the same thing is true, by the way, over here. Just very quickly go back. that missing premise there is actually the whole one of the huge debate around free will in philosophy hinges on that second premise, because many people have a definition of free will where that premise is not true, that free will is actually compatible with everything being determined. Right? Everything being determined is called determinism. Right? So there are compatibilists about free will and determinism who say even if everything's completely determined, including your choices, there's still room for something that we can call free will. Even if your choices are determined, we can still say that some decisions are free will decisions, right? Or some actions are free will actions. So here it's very important to make that implicit premise explicit, because that's exactly where the action lies, right? We might agree that all the events are determined by the past, but what conclusion are we going to draw? Well, it kind of depends on whether you agree with that second premise or not. I think there's one more, maybe two. Let's see. Oh, yeah, a couple more. Here, I'll just tell. I still want you to think about it. You don't have to write it down this time because I'm trying to be done quickly. I don't want to drag it out too much. Unless we know that death is bad, we shouldn't fear it. So don't fear death. Right. Uh, One thing I'll get to the actual question of what's the missing premise, but notice that the conclusion says, so don't fear death. If we're doing critical thinking and we're reconstructing the whole argument into premise, conclusion format, we can't really have it say, don't fear death, because that's a command, like shut the door. And those are not true or false, right? So we actually would have to rephrase that to something like, you should not fear death, right? Into a true false statement. Don't fear death is not a true false statement, but it's trying to say something true, right, as a result of those beginning premises. So we just have to rephrase it. But again, the way people present it in real life, sometimes they use rhetorical questions, right? Sometimes they phrase it as a command. As critical thinkers, we just want to reinterpret that, right? You got to do the beautiful mind thing where we see what you said, and then we rearrange it into premise, conclusion, right? And make sure that each is a true or false statement. Okay. So here, the missing premise, the assumption, the background assumption is we don't know that death is bad. Right? This was Socrates' argument as he was about to imbibe the poison that killed him. Right? Socrates was condemned to death by trial in Athens. And he was condemned to consume a poison that would kill him, and all his followers were crying and he'd been freaking out because he was dying. And Socrates, his whole argument is, you're all acting like you know something. You're all acting like you know that death is a scary, bad thing. You don't know that, so it makes no sense to be fearful. I like that argument. It still doesn't mean that it's not fearful. I always think that's kind of a funny argument, but there's something nice about it, right? Unless we know that death is bad, we shouldn't fear it. We don't know that death is bad, therefore we should not fear it. Jing has read all books by Mo Yan, so he's read that one. Right? So that's a conclusion indicator. So that means he's read that one is a conclusion. And Jing has read all books by Mo Yan is the premise. Well, there's got to be some other premise that says something like, that book right there is by Mo Yan, right? Jing has read all books by Mo Yan. That is a book by Mo Yan. So Jing has read that one. I said I wouldn't rest until the task is done. I guess I'll rest now. Right? It's an appropriate final one. Right? The missing assumption there, or the missing premise, the implicit premise, the tacit premise, there's so many ways to say this, right, is the task is done, right? So the whole thing would be, I said I would not rest until the task is done. The task is done. So I will rest now. Okay, then one more short exercise, which is just doing what we just did, right? Go through each of these and find the implicit argument. And these are all deductive arguments, right? Because all the ones we just looked at right there were deductive. This job is the easiest when the argument is deductive, when it's a logical argument, because again, it's like a reverse inference. It's almost like making an inference to a conclusion, but just in reverse. Right, so go through this and, figure out, you don't have to write it down, but figure out what the premise is and what the conclusion is, right? That's always your first job, right? Is what is the conclusion, and then what are the premises? And then figure out what premise is missing. Right? So for number one, all you'd have to write down there is Senator Greed was caught misusing campaign funds. And any senator who's caught missing campaign funds should resign in his seat. Therefore, Senator Greed should resign. Right. So for number one, you don't have to write anything except for the missing premise, which I'm telling you the answer in this case is Senator Greed was caught misusing campaign funds. Okay, and that's it for now. Did anybody have any questions? Thank you for coming. I really, really do appreciate it very much every time, Nivan and Theodosia. I appreciate you. And I will put up that quiz in just a little bit. All right. I'm going to pause the recording.